Welcome to Progress in San Diego. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I'm your host, Walter Davis, and we'll actually be starting a new format with this show called Progress in the World. Our focus has become more concentrated on the world. So when you see progress in the world in the future, it's just a continuation or an arm of our Progress in San Diego television show. And so we're honored once again to have David Schmidt come back. He's just returned from adventures in Latin America, where he is documenting uh, fair trade. And David is a part of an organization called CAFE, which is creating alternative and fair enterprise. So, welcome, David.
Thank you, Walter. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for coming all the way here to be in the studio with me. Now, we're going to do two parts to this interview. The first area we're going to be looking at is the dark side of the coffee trade and fair alternatives. We're also going to be looking at migration, trade, and brutality in Central America. Now, we've done a whole series of these shows in the past, so be sure to visit our YouTube channel at El Video Liberal to see those other parts. But we're basically in a continuation of this story. And we talked about a lot of horrible things in the past, how people had pesticides sprayed on them in the fields, in the tomato fields, and how people are just dying growing coffee all over the world. We're talking Africa, we're talking a lot of the areas in the so-called third world, developing countries,
Right.
where large American corporations like Philip Morris, Sara Lee, they have CEOs that are making these huge salaries and making $13,000 a day. Yet these people in the fields are making, what, $200 a year or less to grow coffee, and it's causing birth defects. And so without further ado, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background for those of you that are not familiar with our program. I want to go ahead and turn it over to you, David, and you can talk about, your latest discoveries and the things that are important to you.
Sure thing. When you talk about the coffee trade, Walter, you're talking about a trade where a product, it's one of the products in the world that is mostly grown in countries that are known as part of the developing world. Some people call it the third world, and mostly consumed in countries that are part of the developed world, or people know that as the first world sometimes. And there's issues even with those terms, which we can get to a little bit later. But coffee is one of those products. There's coffee, bananas are another one of those products. Cocoa is another one of those products. So these are three huge, and the cocoa bean goes into chocolate, of course, a huge, huge product in Europe, in the US, in Australia, all over the world. So when we talk about these products, there are a lot of people that when you talk about fair trade, a lot of people don't even realize how much our trade is connected to the rest of the world to begin with. So there's all this backup information you have to even start with. When you talk about fair trade with other countries, some people say, well, why don't we just do everything here? Why not just make everything here in the United States? Why even source from other countries? And I think with some products, I think that's a very valid question. And of course, part of the answer is that it's cheaper to exploit people in other countries. That's the basis of it. When you ask why not just buy tomatoes from here, I fully support buying tomatoes that are locally grown, but we have to be ready to pay a little bit more when we're talking about locally grown things. Whereas when you buy a tomato that's been grown on a factory farm, like you mentioned, one of these factory farms in Mexico, in northern Mexico, in Sinaloa, in northern Baja, huge, massive corporate farms where people are out working in the fields as sometimes almost as indentured labor, near slavery conditions sometimes, and having pesticides sprayed on them, having babies with birth defects, having all sorts of terrible health problems. All that goes into that cheap tomato. And the reason that tomato is as cheap as that tomato is because of that exploitation. But with things like tomatoes, you can grow it here. You can grow it in a garden here, you can grow it in a community garden, and there's all sorts of alternatives developing that people in cities like San Diego are working towards to have alternatives to exploitation tomatoes, growing them locally, growing them in urban gardens on rooftops, on top of apartment buildings, There's a movement called Food Not Lawns in San Diego, which works to use the lawn space in houses to grow gardens rather than using it just for grass. So there are a lot of things that we can source locally, but coffee's not one of them. You can try growing coffee in San Diego all your life, and you will probably have very little success.
So what's the climate?
Coffee is a very cantankerous plant. It only grows in certain climates. I don't know the exact figures as far as height above sea level, but I know that there's a few places in the world where coffee grows. And even within Mexico, most of Mexico, coffee doesn't grow there either. But there are a few parts of Mexico that are ideal for coffee. A few of those states, Veracruz, Oaxaca, and Chiapas, and some other states have areas that are ideal for coffee. It involves a certain climate, temperature, certain height above sea level. This combination of factors have to come together for an area to be the right kind of area to grow coffee. So what does that mean practically for us living in the United States of America? It means that when we buy coffee, we are buying it, unless we buy Kona coffee, which is from Hawaii, we are buying it from a country that is in the global south. And in many cases that means Mexico, that means Central America, South America, and other parts of the world, Indonesia, Vietnam, parts of Africa, where that coffee is coming from. But it is impossible to buy locally grown coffee. So when we look at that, and we look at the fact that coffee as a trade is by necessity a trade between countries that are part of the developed world and countries that are part of the developing world, we realize that there are very drastically different kinds of ways of doing that trade, drastically different ways of managing that exchange of money for coffee. And the norm that we have in the world is very exploitative. The way that the coffee trade works and the way that many other international forms of trade work is a way that increases poverty, increases inequality, increases the gap between the rich and the poor, increases suffering, and increases the number of people who are living in poverty as a direct result of the way that we are doing trade in our world. So when we talk about poverty, poverty isn't just some accident that happens somewhere else. It isn't just some unpredictable thing, just some unfortunate circumstance. And I know there's people who think that way. There are people out there who think of poverty as something that it's too bad, tough luck, it's a shame that it happens, it's a shame that people are poor, but they think of it like any other, like a natural disaster, like any number of unpredictable things that might happen to somebody. Where, if I find out that somebody down the street caught a horrible disease or has cancer, I'm going to feel bad for them.
You're lazy.
Right. Or if I hear somebody has a disease, I'll feel bad for them, but am I going to feel like I have a part in them having that disease? Well, probably not. If I hear that somebody on the other side of town, caught some horrible disease, I'm not going to think, could I have done something different? Could I have maybe been a part of that disease attacking that person? Well, I won't. But when it comes to poverty, we need to start thinking that way. When it comes to the poverty that exists in the world, the poverty and suffering that exists in countries that are called the developing world, that is just the flip side of the opulence and of the relative wealth that we have in other countries. The poverty that exists within countries. There are many countries, and the United States is not immune from this either. Most countries on earth have an enormous gap between the rich and the poor. There are estimates put the number of poor in the United States, people living below the poverty line, somewhere around, I think, 50 million right now. The same exists in other countries. In Mexico, the gap between the rich and the poor, the living conditions between the rich and the poor, it's extreme within one country. And those are not two things that are totally unrelated to each other. They're not unrelated from each other. They're directly related to each other. And the reason is because the people who are part of the poor of the world, the people who live in poverty conditions, who live in horrible conditions, people who have left their hometowns, who have left everything that they know to migrate and go somewhere else, they've done that because of these conditions that were caused and created deliberately by the international system of trade that we have, and that we have had for hundreds of years in our world. We have been living within a system that is based on bleeding wealth out of some places and into other places. That's based on bleeding wealth out of certain sectors of the population into other sectors of the population. And the wealth of the rich in our world cannot exist without the poverty of the people whose wealth has been taken. So when we look at poverty, when we look at people who leave towns like San Juan Coatzospam, which is a coffee farming town that I visited for the, I think, fourth or fifth time this last summer. We look at a coffee farming town like that, and look at a town where people have left this town. And a lot of people have left to go work in horrible conditions, like the conditions of the factory farms that we've talked about before. People who leave and choose to work in those conditions, they're leaving towns like San Juan Coatzospam. San Juan Coatzospam is a coffee farming town. And people leave their hometown, they leave everything they know, and they go somewhere else. So why would they do that? They do that because they can't make money farming coffee. They do it because of the exploitation that is inherent in the coffee trade, in the current state of the coffee trade and the way that we trade coffee.
Let's back up. Let's focus on that point for a minute and give some more specifics. Of course, Ronald Reagan persuaded the Mexican government to stop subsidizing the Mexican farmers. And then NAFTA and CAFTA, when you talk about exploitation, NAFTA and CAFTA, those trade treaties and organizations made it impossible for people in Latin America to grow their crops in a way that was affordable for them and to put them out of business. So that's what you mean by our policies and the way that we are doing business. Is that not correct?
Exactly, and that's just the most recent step that's been taken. And when we're talking about the coffee trade, the banana trade, the cocoa trade, we're talking about products that have been traded involving huge amounts of suffering and exploitation over hundreds of years.
So we're talking about slavery. In the
yeah,
slavery
literal
times,
slavery.
This is what slavery was all about. And
exactly.
This is just a modern continuation of that same process.
And it's the exact same dynamic that happens too. It's this very unequal dynamic and a very exploitative international dynamic of trade. But yeah, going back to the colonial days in the Americas, when the European superpowers were taking over the Americas, you had enormous coffee plantations that were being planted in what is now Brazil and Colombia, South America, in Central America and Mexico, and these are the roots of a lot of the inequality that still exists in those countries, because we're talking about the roots being in this plantation-style system, this hacienda-style cacicazo system, where you have this cacique, this plantation owner. And this is when people are being brought over as slaves, or the indigenous people are being enslaved in this coffee trade. In enormous, just breathtaking, astounding numbers of people are being involved in this. The sugarcane trade was another huge part of that in Haiti, what is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And to this day, the sugar trade is also another one of those trades where there's enormous amounts of exploitation of the people who are harvesting the sugarcane, and the people who are working to this day in the Dominican Republic. There are still near slavery conditions in many of the sugarcane plantations in the Dominican Republic. Well, Haitians, a nation that fought for its freedom, a nation that was formerly made up almost exclusively of slaves who fought for and won their freedom in Haiti, are now working in the Dominican Republic in Dominican plantations in almost the same conditions that their ancestors fought to free themselves from. And this is not sugar that is in some other world or some other dimension that we are not connected to. This is the sugar that we're putting in our coffee. This is the sugar that we're using in our cakes and our baked goods. This is Dominican Republic's one of the major suppliers for our major corporate sugar chains. And so you still have this same dynamic in which there's this incredible suffering that's the other part of these products that we just pick up off the shelf, and we never see it. We never see where the products are coming from. We don't walk into the shacks that the sugarcane farmers and harvesters are living in. We don't have to get down in the nitty-gritty and see the conditions they're living in. We don't.
Let's hold that. Now you're talking about the living conditions of farmers. I want to come right back to that. So the difference is now, instead of the slaves working for nothing, they get paid $200 a year, right?
Right.
So wow. Big difference, correct? I mean, they make $200 a year as opposed to in the past when they didn't get paid anything.
And in some conditions, there are literal slaves working in these to this day in these sugarcane plantations in the Dominican Republic. There's been studies done, and many times migrants are lured in with promises of wealth. A lot of the story of a migrant farm worker is a story that's very common all over the world, where somebody gets lured into a situation, often with exaggerated promises of wealth or of how much they're going to make, and they get Their family gets involved. The person, the coyote as it's known in Mexico, the person who involves the migrant farmer, knows where their family lives, tells them, you know, make a down payment, we're going to travel you, we're going to cross you from Haiti over into the Dominican Republic, or from Mexico into the U.S., you'll be working on these factory farms in the U.S., and then they get there, all of a sudden conditions aren't what they were promised, pay's not what they were promised, and in some conditions people are working for zero money, no money at all, and they're in debt for having been crossed over into the country. The people who move them over know where their family lives. They make threats against their family if they speak up against this. And there have been cases of literal slaves working on sugarcane plantations in the Dominican Republic.
Let's hold that.
21st century.
Let's hold that. Okay, so you say that they're being misled. So one of the ways they're being misled is that they have to pay for their food and their shack or home or whatever you want to call that. So their meager little pay that they get, they deduct all those expenses plus the expenses of bringing them into the country. And so they end up owing money to the people that they're working for, so they don't get paid anything. So this is what you're talking about, correct?
Exactly. And again, a lot of people, when they hear about these things, they want to pass the buck. When people hear about this sort of exploitation happening that's part of the products we're consuming, I know a lot of people, when I mention this for the first time, they insist that there's no way that the corporate people running these products, there's no way they could know this is happening. And if they knew it was happening, they would be outraged and they would do something to stop it, because their corporate CEOs are just so noble and humane, and they would never put up with this because we are so humane. It must be something to do with their countries. There must be something wrong with their society, with their culture, with those people, because those people are different from our people, and we are kind and good, and it's those people who do brutal things like this. But the fact of the matter is, this is just it's just part and parcel of the way trade works. And looking at the bigger picture, taking a step back from those cases and the most extreme anecdotal cases, which are cases of literal modern day slaves, taking a step back from that, and when we look at the big picture shows us a big picture of inequality, structural inequality that is part and parcel of how the system functions. The inequality, going back to the coffee trade. In the coffee trade, there are coffee plantations. There are plantations with miserable conditions where thousands of people are working for one landowner. But I want to talk about the other side of exploitation in the coffee trade, the side that is much more indirect. It's a more indirect form of exploitation, and it's almost a more outsourced form of exploitation. And this is the sort of exploitation that I've seen in towns like San Juan Coatzotzpan, where coffee farmers cannot make a living and have to leave town and have to go migrate and go work in these horrible conditions on factory farms in northern Mexico, in the United States, and Canada. So why do they choose to work on those factory farms? It's because of the way coffee is bought and sold in our world. And so I want to talk about, to make a really good comparison, I'd like to talk about the type of coffee farmers that I've met in towns like in San Juan and Coatzotzpan. But I want to talk about coffee farmers who live nearby each other in one state, in the state of Chiapas. Mm-hmm. Chiapas is the southernmost state in Mexico, southern tip of Mexico. It's majority indigenous people live there, people of Mayan ancestry. I was down there. I was there this last summer. 2012 was the last time I was down there. By the way, the Mayan people in Chiapas, they had never heard of the end of the world theory. That was sort of an urban city thing to be thinking about. But the people I was with, I told them about this. They said, "What? End of the world? What are you talking about?" They were not concerned, and we're still here. But these are real Mayan people whose ancestors built the pyramids and were the Mayans. They speak their own languages. The communities I was in, they speak Tzotzil. I learned a bit of the Tzotzil language when I was down there, and very remote regions, very far off there. But I want to talk about the kind of farmers that live there, similar to the kind of farmers that are in the town of San Juan Coatzotzpan, which I visited also. And these are farmers who are not working on somebody else's plantation. So it's not that obvious kind of exploitation where you can come in and look at it and say, wow, there's a guy who's treating these people badly. He's the landowner, the plantation owner, and he's mistreating these people. It's a very subtle, indirect kind of exploitation that happens. Because these coffee farmers, they own their own land. These are farmers, they're what's called smallholders. They're men and women who own their own plot of land. They have a small parcel of land. And this is some of the best coffee in the world is grown in these conditions. Because this is highland coffee that's grown, café de altura in Spanish, coffee grown in highland areas. It's very high altitude area that gives a particular characteristic to the coffee that's very hard to find even within the coffee growing parts of the world. And so in those places, it's very hard to even try to set up plantations. So what you have is a lot of farmers who own their own plot of land, and they farm a little bit of coffee, relatively speaking, compared to the big plantations you might find in Brazil or Colombia or even Vietnam to this day, for instance. And so these farmers, they have a few acres of land, they farm the coffee, they work very hard, they farm the coffee, and these farmers, backing up a bit in history, maybe 30 years ago, before the neoliberal policies you mentioned with Reagan, later with Clinton, NAFTA and CAFTA, before those policies existed, Mexico's government was subsidizing these farmers, and they maintained a baseline price that you could predict. And ever since NAFTA was signed with Mexico and Canada and the US, that baseline price disappeared. So farming coffee, you had no idea, and to this day, if you're an independent coffee farmer that's not part of an organization, you don't know how much money you're going to make from selling your coffee. So let's say I'm one of these farmers. I'm one of these Mayan indigenous farmers in the highlands of Chiapas, and I'm not connected to any sort of fair trade network. I'm not connected to any coffee farming association or organization or cooperative. I'm just farming on my own, which is the case for most coffee farmers out there. So when I go through all year working to get my coffee harvest, and then I harvest the coffee, what do I do with that coffee? How does that coffee end up thousands of miles away in some Starbucks up in Seattle, in San Diego, in some city in the US, in Toronto, in Europe? How does the coffee get there? Well, I have to sell the coffee to somebody. So I sell the coffee to one of these many intermediaries that are working out there. I sell these intermediaries, they're known as coyotes in Mexico. Interestingly enough, the word coyote is also used for human smugglers. Coyote is anybody who moves products around, smuggles products, and it's a sort of a pejorative term, especially in the coffee trade. Coffee farmers, they don't care for the coyotes. They don't care for these intermediaries because they are always getting screwed over by the coyotes. So I've worked all year to get this coffee harvest. I've gotten, my family's come together, neighbors have come together, we've helped each other out, we've harvested the coffee, and then we have to sell the coffee to the coyote, to the intermediary. He'll come in, it's usually a he. He comes in and he tells me the price he wants to tell me. And in most cases, if I'm a coffee farmer, I don't have access to the internet. I don't have access to these market prices, market figures. I don't have access to that information. I am dependent solely on that coyote. And in many cases, he's the only coyote who buys from my village or from my area of the mountains. And he's my only connection to the outside world. And so I am totally dependent on that intermediary. And he comes up and he says, guess what, David, the coffee, you've got 50 kilos of coffee to sell me. Coffee's going at 40 pesos a kilo. And I'll say, okay, that sounds good. And he says, okay, bag it up for me, I'll be back in the afternoon. He comes back in the afternoon and says, you know what, I've got bad news, David, the market price dropped while you were bagging it up. Now it's at 30 pesos a kilo. But, I mean, you can have it, love it, or leave it, but I'm the only one you're going to sell to. I have to sell it to him. So I sell it to him, and all of that work, I get undercut on the price. He gives me the price he wants to give me. But again, he doesn't do that because he's a bad person. He doesn't do that because he's some sort of evil person off in some place that has nothing to do with us up here, or nothing to do with Starbucks' corporate bosses in Seattle, or nothing to do with Nestle or Sara Lee, these major corporations that are buying the coffee. He's part of the system. They need him to gouge the coffee farmer on the price. They need that to happen, because they're not going to turn a profit if that doesn't happen. And he's not going to turn a profit. He's a businessman, they're businessmen, and neither of them are going to turn a profit unless they all gouge that coffee farmer on his price. So the coyote, he buys it up, and then he brings it to a distribution level, or he passes it on to another coyote, another intermediary, and there's these several steps that happen between that coffee going from there, and most of it eventually goes to a group called AMSA. AMSA is one of the major buyers. It's a huge organization in Mexico. It operates under a lot of different corporate names. And AMSA, it's AMSA, it stands for Agricultores Mexicanos SADCB, which is a corporate title. But AMSA is one of the major buyers for the big coffee out there. So AMSA, operating under all these different corporate and business names in Mexico, AMSA is buying for Starbucks, for Nestle, for Sara Lee. Nestle is their biggest client. And so AMSA, their goal over the past few decades has been to monopolize the coffee trade in Mexico at a national level. So what AMSA wants to do, they want to put any competition out of business. They especially want to put these small farmer-owned co-ops out of business. They want to be running the whole show. And of course, once they are running the whole show, they're going to gouge people on the prices even more. And that's what happens when you get a monopoly. When you get one guy running the whole show, of course, he's going to pay you whatever he feels like paying you. And so that's the state of coffee farmers in the conventional coffee trade. That's the kind of conditions that they're in. But it's very misleading if you were to just go look at them. Because if you visit, you would go look at this coffee farmer's village, and it's a beautiful place in the highlands of Chiapas. Gorgeous, just green, lush green scenery everywhere. Women in traditional woven Mayan blouses walking up and down the street. Verdant jungle type forest vegetation. I mean, it's a beautiful place to live, and you see people are happy to be with their families, with their communities, places they've lived for generations now. And you look at that and you say, why would somebody leave this place? They leave it because they're getting gouged on the price of their coffee. They leave it because there are no controls in place to guarantee them a fair price for the coffee that they are working with their own sweat and blood on their own land. And so that's one side of it. Now I want to talk about the other way of farming coffee, the other way of trading coffee and of buying and selling coffee. And that is the fair trade way. So, keep in mind that first coffee farmer in the highlands of Chiapas, and let's look at somebody else who lives in that same region, but who is part of a fair trade co-op. Now, what that means is this other farmer, he is part of, let's call him Marcos, because Marcos is one of the gentlemen I stayed with when I was down there. Marcos is part of a co-op called Mayevinik, and what that means is Marcos and hundreds of other coffee farmers like him, they all own this coffee business together as workers. It's a worker-owned business in which all the coffee farmers have come together. They formed this business a few decades ago, around the late 80s, early 90s, I believe. And excuse me. These coffee farmers, they own their own business, and they do business directly with the importers and the roasters and the people who are buying the coffee in Mexico, in the US, in Canada, in Europe, in Japan. They have direct trade with those people as an association, as a co-op of coffee farmers. So if I'm Marcos and I want to sell my coffee, what do? I don't have to depend on this coyote, this intermediary who's going to come in and gouge me on the price. If I'm Marcos, I am part of this big organization of about 800 members, is what Mayevinik has. And so I farm the coffee. I get help from the organization. I don't have to lug the coffee into town on my back on a bag, as many of the independent farmers have to do. The organization has transportation, the organization, which we all pay into it, and we're all part of this organization together. And so the organization transports the coffee. The organization has its own machinery and has its own way of processing the coffee. You have to get the husk off the coffee. You have to dry it out. There's all sorts of steps in processing coffee to get it down to the coffee bean that you and I have seen in the supermarket. And so normally for the other coffee farmer I talked about, who is not part of any fair trade co-op or organization and depends on the intermediaries and is selling directly to big coffee and corporations, that farmer, he has to sell his coffee unprocessed, because there's no way he's going to be able to afford all the machinery to process that coffee at home. So he sells it unprocessed for the price of unprocessed coffee, which is much lower. Marcos, on the other hand, because he's part of a fair trade organization, he brings it to their headquarters, which is near Acteal, Chiapas, a little town named Acteal. And at their headquarters, they have the machinery, they process the coffee, and Marcos gets a much higher price for that coffee. Now, how is that price set? Is it set by some intermediary who just tells them whatever price they want to? Well, no. The price is set because this organization, collectively, they deal directly with the buyers, and these buyers are often part of fair trade movements, fair trade organizations. They're interested in giving a fair price to coffee farmers like Marcos. And so they have this direct form of trade and negotiation. They come together. And also, as being a part of a co-op like Mayevinik, Marcos has access to market information, to market prices. They have access to all this information that's out there on the internet these days. Now, in addition to all of that, the process of getting certified as a fair trade organization means that an organization like Mayevinik undergoes the certification process. And this organization, part of that certification process means that the price that's paid for that coffee, out of that price, an additional fair trade bonus or fair trade premium is paid, which gets reinvested back in the communities. And in the case of Maya Unique, it's gotten reinvested in the co-op, in the communities and development of the communities. In some places, it gets invested in schools and education and health clinics and building roads in the communities. And the community decides collectively how they want to reinvest that money. Now, what does Marcos's business life look like? Is he dependent on these intermediaries, or dependent on big business to tell him what to do? No, he's part of this organization, and so this organization makes decisions collectively and democratically. They come together and they sit down together, and as coffee farmers, they decide what they want to do with their own organization, because it belongs to them, to nobody else, only to them, collectively, as Mayan indigenous coffee farmers. They decide what to do with their organization, where to sell to, what sort of products to invest in. Lately, they've decided to invest in honey and I think macadamia trees lately. So they decide what they're going to do, and they carve out their own future together as farmers standing together hand in hand with each other. So what's the end result of that? You don't see many people from areas like where Marcos lives that are part of a fair trade coffee organization. You don't see those people leaving because they don't have to leave. They're getting a more fair price, and they're part of their own destiny as coffee farmers. They're part of making these key decisions themselves. They're not having decisions made for them. So they're not leaving. They don't have to leave. They're not forced to leave and go work on somebody else's land in northern Mexico or in the U.S. or in Canada. They're creating that themselves.
So what kind of efforts are being made by these organizations to reach out to the other farmers who are not part of these fair trade organizations?
It's different for every fair trade co-op. Some of them have made active efforts to reach out to the other farmers. Others, Maya Unique, it's fairly small as far as fair trade coffee organizations go. For instance, in the state of Oaxaca, where San Juan Coatzotzpan is, which is a town I've talked about a lot with you on this program, in the case of the state of Oaxaca, there are a few very big fair trade coffee organizations that do make active efforts to go out and meet with coffee farmers. And in fact, I've visited a couple of them. One is called SEPCO and one is called USIRI. Another one is called Michisa. They're three very large fair trade coffee organizations in Oaxaca. And I met with them 2 years ago, before I went up to Coatzotzpan. I met with them first and actually talked with some of their members, and their members have been slowly discussing with the coffee farmers in Coatzotzpan. And it's a very slow process of really trying to meet with people, developing that trust, because they don't know each other, they're not sure who these guys represent, but slowly they've been making contact and inroads with them and talking about, look, we're coffee farmers like you guys. I've just tried to facilitate the contacts and take myself out of it as much as possible, because I mean it's a very suspicious thing when this foreigner who looks like me rolls into town and just says, hey, I've got a great deal for you guys. Most of the time when that's happened in history, it hasn't gone so well for indigenous farmers like the people in San Juan Coatzotzpan. So as far as trustworthiness, me coming in there with them, barely having known me over the last 6 years or so, I'd prefer them to talk to other coffee farmers who are like them and who can say, hey, we're a member of this group Michisa, or this group Usiri, or this group SEPCO, and we can tell you how we've done things, and we've done things different, and we've formed our own organization. And they do make efforts to do that, and talk to other farmers and say, hey, there's another way to farm coffee. You don't have to get screwed over on the price like this.
So I'm imagining that some of these coyotes are violently opposed to this. Is there violence?
There have been. Not in the places I've been, thank God, up to this point anyway. I would expect it if as communication gets as communication about fair trade and about other alternatives starts to happen more and more. I'd be surprised if it didn't happen. I've heard anecdotal stories of violence happening. Of course, when it happens, it's always somebody hires out some thugs for hire. Of course, the coyote, he's not going to go in himself and dirty his hands. But I mean, in places like San Juan Coatzotzpan, right now that's the town in Oaxaca that I've visited a few times. Right now that town is directly dependent on AMSA, which is the big corporate buyer. They're doing business directly with AMSA, which is the big buyer for Nestle, for the big coffee corporations. And if they start to challenge that or start to stand up to that, I'd be a little concerned about how some of AMSA's people would react when towns like Coatzacoalcos start to stand up to that monopoly and say, hey, we don't want to be monopolized, we don't want to be screwed over on the price, we want to look at our different options, we want to look at the possibility of dealing with other fair trade co-ops. They're not going to take it quietly. Big coffee, big corporate coffee is they're not taking it quietly, in fact. But sidestepping the issue of violence, the way they've been dealing with it mostly has been, again, using very sneaky business practices to try to undercut the fair trade co-ops and try to drive them out of business. Now, one of the latest things that AMSA has been doing lately in communities that do have a strong presence of fair trade co-ops, sometimes an entire community joins, other times there's individual farmers that join the fair trade co-op within a community. But in communities that have a strong presence from these fair trade co-ops in Oaxaca, AMSA will send its people in, and they'll actually offer people a higher price for their coffee in the short run because they want to run the co-op out of business. And so when you look at it in the short run, it sounds great, like great, 5 pesos per kilo more for my coffee, that's awesome. But the reason they're doing it is to drive the co-ops out of business. Once the co-ops are out of the picture, then AMSA monopolizes the entire region, and then guess what's going to happen to the price? Are they going to keep on paying 55 pesos a kilo?
No,
I don't think so.
Price.
Drop it on down. And that's what they've been doing lately. So it's that kind of tricky business deals, and also straight up just lying to coffee farmers, like the farmers in Coatzacoalcos. I actually was there when some AMSA representatives were meeting with them, and I have recordings of it and everything. AMSA representatives of big corporate coffee lied to the coffee farmers in San Juan Coatzacoalcos. They told them that they were going to certify them as organic producers, as fair trade producers, where AMSA is not authorized to certify anybody as organic or fair trade. The last time I was there last year, AMSA had hung up a big banner in Coatzacoalcos in their main town square, and the banner says that they are certified, and it has all these different labels of different kinds of certifications. Rainforest Alliance, UTS, Fair Trade, Organic. These are certifications that AMSA is not able to give out. These are certifications you only get by dealing with the third party that comes and certifies you as a organic producer or a fair trade producer. And so AMSA is lying to them, and I think the goal of that must be to convince these people that they don't have any other options. Because the farmers will say, well, if we're already certified, we have all these certifications, and we're only getting paid 35 pesos a kilo, how could we expect a higher price? And this must be the highest price we can ever get. So there's no point in looking into other options or looking into fair trade co-ops or joining a fair trade co-op because AMSA told us we already are certified. They told us we're already fair trade. And the other side to that is I'm wondering if AMSA, who sells this coffee to Nestle and Starbucks and the big guys, I'm wondering if they are labeling this coffee as fair trade, even though it's not being produced by a fair trade worker-owned co-op.
So I'm seeing coffee labeled as fair trade in Starbucks.
Right, and I mean, there's been much more in-depth investigations. I don't feel like I could really go into the details of that, but I know people have written reports on Starbucks' fair trade coffee. The short answer is it's a better bet than buying their non-fair trade coffee. If you're in Starbucks, it's a better bet to get the stuff that has the fair trade label on it.
Can you give us an idea of how much the difference is? Okay, if these guys are getting, say, 40 pesos a kilo, and a Starbucks coffee costs $3, it's probably a couple of hundred times more, right, per kilo that we're paying in the Starbucks.
Right, and that's, I mean, a big part of that differential that gets cut down with fair trade producing organizations is a lot of those organizations, the value of the product goes up as the product gets processed. And every step of being processed, from having the husk taken off of it, to then there's like an interior husk, I forget what it's called, that gets taken off, then it gets dried out, then it gets roasted, and with every step it increases in value. And the biggest value increaser is roasting the coffee and then grinding it and making a cup of coffee. And that's the biggest value added process. Now, fair trade organizations, they sell a lot of coffee that's not been roasted, because the thing is, once it's roasted, it has a shelf life of a few weeks ideally before the quality starts to go down. Mm-hmm. In the case of organizations like Michisa, like I almost said Starbucks, like Maya Vinic, fair trade organizations like that, many of those organizations, they've developed their own roaster plants, and they're roasting the coffee and selling it locally or selling it within Mexico. And so, because of their fair trade connections, they're able to sell the coffee when it's been roasted, which means they keep a much greater part of the profits. Which means that all that value added that happens when the coffee is processed, roasted, and ground, that value goes back to the coffee farmers themselves. Maya Unique, I was with them 2 years ago. I went back to visit them this last summer, 2012. I visited their offices in San Cristobal de las Casas, which is a smaller city nearby the highlands of Chiapas. In that city, they now have a cafe. They have their own coffee shop. And so at this point, they've come full circle, and the coffee farmers, they are running every single step of the process right up to the point where that coffee is getting served in a cup to you. So all that value is going back to the coffee farmers of Maya Unique. And I was in the coffee shop. I hung out with my friends who I knew from the year before, and it's all members of the co-op that are working in the coffee shop, or their kids, coffee farmers' kids. And so these are kids they're not running off to go to some other city or looking for work or looking somewhere else for their future. These kids, their future is right here in Chiapas, and they're working in the coffee shop that is owned by their parents. It's owned by the coffee farmers. So every step of that value added is going back into those communities.
So this corporate business model is quite damaging in a lot of ways, and so we're seeing efforts to reverse this damaging corporate or globalism, where a lot of the local benefit is being taken away from the community, and the wealth is going out to some of the locations. So the co-ops are actually facilitating keeping wealth within the area.
Exactly, and developing it within that area. And it's a beautiful example of a real viable alternative. We're not talking about some theoretical other model or some pie in the sky utopia. We're talking about something that is happening here and now. It's happening in communities like these parts of Chiapas, where the coffee farmers, they've totally taken that historical process of wealth being bled out of their region, and they're reversing it. They're making a 180.
Well, that's a wonderful thing. What can people do to help you?
Change the way that you buy things. Change the kinds of products you buy. I don't want to tell anybody to not buy things. We're all going to buy things. We're all going to eat. We're all going to drink. We're all going to wear clothes. We're not just going to stop existing. I've known people who have tried to go that route. I've known a few people who become so filled with guilt and almost self-loathing at being part of a system that causes so much exploitation and poverty and inequality that they want to drop out of the system. I personally, I respect people who choose to do that. I think it's a decision of conscience. Personally, I don't think that's the answer, because people drop out every day. People die every day. If I just drop out and decide I'm only going to dumpster dive for my food, and I'm going to only wear used clothes or not wear clothes and just sit around naked in my house and not eat things, if I do that, all I'm doing is I'm just making one more person that's dropped out of the system, like all the people who die every day out there. But the thing is, people drop out, people die, and then new people are born, and as long as the system is in place, this system that is based on so much international exploitation that we live in, as long as that system is in place, it's going to stay in place, because people are going to keep on feeding into it. And it's going to stay in place until we start creating alternative ways of doing trade. And so I would say, don't stop drinking coffee. I love coffee. I'm proud to be a coffee addict. I'm proud to be an addict of that beautiful caffeine that's in the coffee, and the taste and the aroma. It's beautiful. Don't stop drinking coffee. Just buy fair trade coffee. Buy coffee that's been bought fairly, that's been produced by fair trade co-ops. And you'll be supporting the coffee farmers themselves. Just change the kind of coffee you're drinking. Because the fact of the matter is, whether it's coffee or bananas or chocolate or even just food, fruits and vegetables, I'm not saying don't buy them, don't eat them. I'm saying change the way that you buy them, change the kinds of products you buy. As much as you can, look for the fair trade label. Look for and don't just trust a group that, like Starbucks, tells you all of its coffee is fairly traded. Unless it has that label on it, it hasn't gone through any oversight at all. And so look for that fair trade label, and as much as possible. And if in many cases you can just buy local. In many cases you can sidestep these exploitative corporate models with something as simple as tomatoes, as simple as vegetables. Right now, I think the statistic is 45% of the tomatoes that we eat in the United States were grown in Mexico. And the vast majority of those, I can guarantee you, Walter, were grown in extremely rough conditions. And so what do? Do we just stop eating tomatoes? Well, no. We cease paying into this exploitation model, and we start paying into this other model of buying and selling and producing tomatoes.
And we start demanding that the stores start carrying fair trade.
Exactly, or that they carry locally produced, or we start going to farmers markets, or we become part of these Food Not Lawns groups, or part of these community garden projects, and in many cases, and we start creating and feeding into alternatives. The fact is, you're going to buy something, you're going to eat something, but the money that you spend on the food you eat, that can go two places. That can go into feeding poverty and exploitation, or that can go into feeding change and feeding prosperity for all of us, feeding a different way of buying and selling and working and living on this planet where we can all come out ahead, where we don't have to be losers and winners.
And there's also a great benefit because some of these products have deadly amounts of pesticides inside of them. And so we're actually doing our family harm by buying some of these exploitative products, giving a piece of a peach to an infant. I mean, I just saw in Bonds a huge shipment of beautiful looking peaches, and they're all from Chile.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering what kinds of pesticides might be inside of those. We've already seen how these children and men and women have a lot of birth defects and other health issues as a result of the pesticides. So the major American corporations are able to grow these products in other parts of the world without adhering to internationally sanctioned methodologies that prevent deadly pesticides from being placed inside of the meat of these fruits that we're eating. So there is also a health benefit in terms of purchasing
Absolutely.
fair trade.
Yeah, purchasing fair trade, purchasing organic, and buying local. It's very simple, and there's an immediate benefit. Now that's the minimum, I would say, because again, we're all going to buy and eat certain things, so just use your dollars wisely. Stop supporting the stuff that is produced by exploitation, and buy the other stuff instead. Buy the things that support equality. Beyond that, there's certain products that are much. Right now, it's hard to find them in fair trade versions, or in local versions, or in organic versions. They're scarce because there's not enough buyers. It's hard to get to places where they're sold. For instance, I don't know anybody who buys 100% fair trade certified everything, because it would be virtually impossible. It would be expensive in many cases, and your carbon footprint would be like 20 times mine, because you're driving all over town getting this stuff. So as an individual, there's only so much you can do, but collectively we can all come together, and we can push for this slow rising tide of fair trade, this rising tide of different ways of buying and selling. The way we can do that is by coming together and pressuring groups and communities that we're a part of to make the switch. That community or that group, it might be the college you go to. Come together, and I can send plenty of resources to anybody about how to run a campaign at a college campus to push to make the switch over to fair trade coffee from exploitation coffee. So come together as a college, get a group of people who think like you, who care about this stuff. Push for your church, your religious community, your synagogue, your mosque, to purchase whatever they're purchasing, whether it's coffee or chocolate or the clothing that they purchase. If your children go to a school that buys uniforms, talk to the school, talk to the other parents or the PTA about making those fair trade purchase uniforms. They use fair trade coffee grown not on plantations, but grown by fair trade co-ops of cotton farmers, and then were sewn by co-ops of fair trade seamstresses. So again, we're all part of buying and selling things, and there's only so much we can do individually, but collectively we can come together with each other and take these big groups that we're part of. All of us are part of some big groups or many big circles, so we can push for those circles to make the switch collectively, and that's the only way that we're going to beat this thing. That's the only way we're going to create this rising tide of conscious consumers who want to change the way that we buy and sell things.
So you wanted to hit on 2 points. Have you talked as much as you want to about migration, trade, and brutality in Central America? Do you need to go into more detail on that? We've been going about an hour so far.
I think I would love to go into that in a sort of separate conversation.
Okay.
If you're up for it, I'd love to go into more detail on that. I've been focusing mostly just on the coffee trade and the dynamics of fair trade.
Okay. Well, we can definitely do that. So we're going to go ahead and take a break and come back for part two. If some of you are joining us online, please come back. We'll be starting momentarily with our next broadcast on migration, trade, and brutality in Central America. We've had David Schmidt with us, and we'll be continuing. This is Walter Davis. Thank you very much.